Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast. I'm really glad that you're with me today. And this is the fourth episode of a new series that I began called Understanding Your Story. And I've got 16 principles that I'm sharing with you guys. And so far, we've made it through Principle 7, or I should say halfway through Principle 7. And I'm going to continue the second half of Principle 7 today. But our 7 principles are this. Principle 1, every person's life is made up of many different stories. Principle 2, stories hold power in people's hearts and lives. Principle 3, stories can hold a variety of negative and destructive powers within them. Principle 4, the negative and destructive power that lives in people's stories is like poison in their soul. Principle 5, some stories in people's lives hold more power than other stories. Principle 6, stories follow people through their lives. And Principle 7, the principle that we're currently on, stories layer themselves in people's lives and create life themes. And if you were with me last time when I began Principle 7, we began to talk about this concept of stories layering themselves in a person's life. And I gave a metaphor of making a lasagna. But when you make a lasagna, you make layers of noodles, then sauce, then ricotta cheese, then other cheese, then noodles, then sauce. And you fill up the pan, and you end up with a lasagna based upon all those layers. And I might suggest that the person that we end up with is predicated upon the stories that get layered in their life. I then offered 2 different examples of this principle. The first one was Jenny from the movie Forrest Gump, and I kind of reviewed this character from the movie and how these stories began to layer themselves in her life. Story after story after story layered on top of each other, and how the accumulation of these layered stories accrued for Jenny to become the person that she was. And then I shared a story of a woman. My wife and I were going to this Bible study group. Coincidentally, it was called Stories. And we met this woman, and we learned, as we got to know her more and more, we learned her life story. And we saw that a primary theme in her life had to do with fear and insecurity and a theme of rejection. And as we learned her story, we saw these stories, one after the other, where she had been essentially rejected by significant people and in the significant relationships of her life. For example, her father left the family when she was young, and that was a kind of rejection. And then the group of girls at school ostracized her. That was a rejection. And then her best friend rejected her. Then her boyfriends rejected her. Then her fiancé rejected her. So we see these stories layer in themselves, and she ended up in the place where she was insecure in her relationship with God, and she thought, God's going to leave me too because everybody else has left me. So we see how the layers of her stories accrued toward a kind of theme that was emerging in her life and soul. And that brings us to where I left off in our last episode, and I'm continuing the second half of Principle 7. Stories layer themselves in people's lives and create life themes. And I'd like to continue this episode today by bringing our attention to the fact that the Bible makes it very clear that we have a very real enemy, a spiritual enemy, who literally intends to perpetrate harm and destruction upon our lives. John chapter 10, verse 10 says, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy, but I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, "Be alert and sober-minded, for your enemy the devil prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour." And then a very interesting scripture in Luke chapter 4, verse 13, around the temptation of Jesus himself. And it says, it kind of at the end of the story, when the devil had finished all his tempting, he left Jesus until a more opportune time. And I think this is kind of an interesting concept that it says that the devil left Jesus until a more opportune time, because it kind of teaches me that the devil is shrewd. Evil is shrewd. I would advocate that the devil's been around since the beginning of humanity, right? The devil appeared as a serpent in the Garden of Eden, and he tempted the very first two human beings, Adam and Eve. So the devil's been around. He's been watching people. He's been watching humanity since the very beginning, and he kind of, I hate to say it, but I think maybe he's kind of like this shrewd, insane psychiatrist or something. He's watching human beings, and he kind of knows what makes people tick, and he knows how to read people. And he could tell maybe that Jesus is too strong right now. He's resisting these temptations that I'm offering him. So therefore, I'm going to leave, and I'm going to wait for a more opportune time, which tells me the devil kind of watches people, and he's waiting. He's waiting. He's waiting. No, this isn't a good time to deploy my attack. He's not ready. He's not weak enough. I'm going to wait for the opportune time, the maximum opportunity for me to deploy my attack against this particular human being. But the point I'm making, you guys, is simply this. I believe the devil is unbelievably shrewd. He knows what makes people tick. He knows when people are weak. He knows when people are vulnerable. And he knows exactly where to attack people. That's kind of my point. And how to attack people to perpetrate the maximum amount of harm and destruction upon their life. For example, in the previous story of the woman who had the theme of rejection, she was rejected over and over and over again in her life. Do you think that it was a coincidence that this woman had all these stories of rejection layered one on top of the other and other, layered in her life the way that all those things happen? Because I don't. I think the devil was watching this woman's life. I think the devil watches people's lives, and he waits for this exact opportune time to launch his attack. And he knows that this person is weak in this area, so he knows how to attack them. He knows that this person is weak in this area. This other person's weak in this area. So that's how I'm going to attack him. And so like a shrewd enemy, he calculates this attack and how he's going to try to put these layers of hurt and pain and brokenness in people's lives so that he can make a metaphorical, a spiritual lasagna. He's going to layer these things in a person's life to perpetrate the maximum amount of harm and destruction upon them. And you guys probably know that I'm an outdoorsman. I love to hunt and camp and hike and fish and all that stuff. And the way that I can literally aim my gun, if I have a scope, I can put the crosshairs on my target. If I have open sights, I line up the front bead on the end of the barrel with the groove in my rear sight, and I align those sights, and I take an aim at my target. And I would suggest that this is exactly what evil does. Evil knows how to aim at people because he knows what their weakness is, and he knows the opportune time to attack them. So he aligns his sights accordingly. And I think the devil, for example, in our previous example, this particular woman, he knew her deepest area of pain and vulnerability revolved around the reality of this theme of rejection. So the devil saw an opportune time, and therefore he goes about the business of designing and provoking experiences and stories of rejection in her life. And he begins to layer story after story after story after story of rejection in her heart and life. Or said another way, I think the devil aims at people and he aligns his sights on their heart and on their life, and he studies them. He gets to know them, and he observes their weaknesses and vulnerability, and then he designs his attacks accordingly in order to maximize the damage that he intends to unleash. And by the way, the Bible speaks of this reality, what's called familiar spirits or yada spirits. And this is exactly what's being referred to by this concept, I believe, of familiar spirits. They are spirits or demons and principalities that are assigned to people's lives, and they literally watch people grow up from childhood in their families of origin, and they already know the history of this family of origin because they knew the great-grandfather and then the grandfather and then the father, and now here's a little boy that's been born into this family that I'm already familiar with. The generational proclivities and weaknesses and sinful tendencies that exist in this family, I'm familiar with this family. So now this little boy's been born into this family. So these demons and principalities watch people grow up from childhood. They literally study people. They get to know people, or we might say they become familiar with this person, with this little boy, and they become well acquainted with the hurt and the pain or the sadness of this person's life. They become well acquainted or familiar with this person's weaknesses and vulnerabilities. As in my previous example, the familiar spirits would see, oh, this little girl is hurt by rejection. She's been rejected here and here and here. So I'm going to lay more layers of rejection. I'm going to follow the groove of rejection, and I'm going to cut a groove. I'm going to embed something in her soul that will perpetrate the maximum amount of harm and destruction upon her. And why? John 10:10, because the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. So these principalities watch and they wait for this opportune time. They know this person's weakness and vulnerabilities, and they know the temptations that they're vulnerable to. So then they design, I think, and provoke their evil and diabolical plans and attacks, all designed toward the harm and destruction of this particular person's life. And again, they do this because the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. And so let me apply this just to my own life in the way of example. In my own life, I can see how many different stories were layered in just the right order and combination to affect the trajectory of my life toward the sexually broken person that I would become. In fact, if you were to look at the top 10 list that I talked about previously, I actually recommend that people do 2 top 10 lists. The first top 10 is the 10 most hurtful, painful events or situations of your life. The second top 10 list is the top 10 most shameful things that you yourself have done in your life. The first list is kind of the top 10 hurtful things that happened to you in life. The second top 10 list is the top 10 shameful things that you yourself have done. But my point is this, that if you were to look at the top 10 list of the most hurtful things that have ever happened in my life, at least 8 of them concern the issue of sex. And most of those occurred during my childhood and adolescence. And if you were to look at the second list, Tony's top 10 list of shame, the most shameful things that I've ever done in my life, all 10 of those things are sexual in nature. So just kind of think of it this way, in the metaphor of a mathematical formula. Imagine this, that if we were to take 10 twos and add them all up together, they would add up to 20. Or said another way, 2 plus 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 2 equals 20. 10 twos equal 20. So in much the same way, if you were to take the top 10 stories of Tony's life and add them all up together, or what if you took the top 18 or 20 stories of Tony's life, the top 10 painful things that happened to Tony, but then the top 10 shameful things that Tony has done? And what if it just so happened coincidentally that the primary theme of each of these top 10 stories of Tony's life or top 20 stories of Tony's life were sexual in nature? Then what do you think the combination of those 10 or 20 stories would add up to together, or what would they look like in Tony's heart and life? Or said another way, if we added up in Tony's life sex, 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 sex. 20 stories of my life with the theme of sex. The most hurtful things of my life, the most shameful things of my life. Story after story after story after story after story after story being layered in Tony's soul, being layered in Tony's life like a metaphorical lasagna, layer after layer after layer after layer. What do you think these stories would equal in the way that 10 twos equal 20? What would these layers of stories about sex equal in Tony's heart and life? What would be the implications of these stories in my life? And if you're not sure, I'll just go ahead and tell you. It would equal a very deeply wounded and broken young man in the sexual area of his life. It would equal a young man with a growing sexual addiction. It would equal a young man who was not able to control sex and who was in fact being controlled by sex. It would equal a young man who was powerless to resist sexual temptation. It would equal a young man who was powerless to walk in sexual purity, even though he became a Christian when he was 16 years old. It would equal a man who was powerless to honor God with the expression of his sexual gift. And eventually, it would equal a married Christian man who was unable to honor his wife and honor the vows that he gave to his wife on his wedding day with the sexual part of his life. And why? Because stories layer themselves in people's lives and they create themes. And all those sexualized stories of my life added up together, layered one after the other in my life, and they were creating the theme of sexual brokenness in my heart and life. And friend, in conclusion of this particular point, that stories layer themselves in people's lives and create themes, I just want to invite you to begin to consider and contemplate the story of your own life, or better said, the stories of your life. Because I would suggest that the way your life has worked out and the things that have happened to you and the person that you've become and the person you are today, the primary hurts and pains and issues that you've struggled with in your life and that you're still struggling with, are not a coincidence. And the fact is that every person is the sum total of the stories of their life. And I believe that if you'll do what can be the very difficult work of turning toward your story and facing your story and moving toward your story and entering your story and beginning to process your story, all these things we're going to talk about in upcoming episodes as understanding your story continues. But as you do these things, it's going to allow you to begin to understand yourself better than you've ever understood yourself before, and it's going to allow you to begin to understand why your life has unfolded and turned out the way it's turned out. It's going to allow you to begin to understand and see and comprehend why you've struggled so much in the particular areas of your life where you've struggled so much. It's going to help you see and understand the areas of your heart and life where you were so deeply hurt and wounded. And it's going to help you understand how and why you've made so many of the life choices and decisions that you've made, and why you probably choose many of the coping mechanisms and strategies in your life that you've used in the attempt to manage and minimize and anesthetize the pain of your life and soul. And it's going to help you begin to see and understand the areas of your heart and life and of your past where you most need the light and the truth and the healing and the redemption of God. And it's going to help you begin to cooperate with God on this healing journey and the healing and redemptive path that God has intended for your life. And by the way, we're going to talk more about these things in the principles of understanding your story that are still to come. I've got 16 principles, and we've only covered 7 now. But with all that being said, it brings us to our next principle, which is Principle 8. And what I want to do with this principle, you guys, is begin to really apply these principles and concepts to the issue of sex in our life and helping us understand how we became the sexual men that we became, how we became so wounded and broken in the sexual area of our life, maybe why we're still wounded and broken and struggling, why I'm a Christian man, I go to church, but I can't resist looking at internet porn, and no matter how hard I try, I keep acting out. What's wrong with me? Well, I think Principle 8 might help us understand the roots and the origins of how we became who we are. You see, Principle 7 taught us that something was getting layered in our life that was turning us into who we would become. But Principle 8 is this: every person's life has many sexual stories. I talked about in the first episode of this series, Understanding Your Story, the metaphor of the jigsaw puzzle, how every person's life is the sum total of the stories of their life. And in the metaphor of the puzzle, every piece of the puzzle represents a story of your life. And as we assemble all these stories from our life, a picture begins to emerge. But the point of Principle 8 here, every person's life has many sexual stories. Can you imagine if your life was a jigsaw puzzle and every story of your life was a piece of the puzzle? How many of those pieces would have to do with sex? How many sexual stories do you have in your life and in your past? Or said another way, I'd suggest that there are many stories that contribute to the shaping and development of who a person becomes sexually. Or said another way, in view of our previous point, Principle 7, stories layer themselves and create themes, most people end up having many sexual stories layered in their life, one after the other after the other. And as I've mentioned before, as a counselor, an assignment that I often give to people is for them to create a sexual inventory of their life. And with this inventory, they're to literally write out and catalog and document as accurately and thoroughly as they can a complete chronological overview of the entire sexual history of their life. And as you can only imagine, this can be a pretty scary and intimidating thing for many people to do. But the point in mentioning this is that it's surprising to me how many people, when they do a sexual inventory of their life, that they respond with a kind of shock or surprise about how much stuff is really there on the sexual journey of their life. Like they might say, holy cow, I didn't realize there was this much stuff. And when I write it all down like this and I see it all together, all at the same time, I'm a little bit surprised at the full extent of my sexual activity, including all the stuff that's happened to me and all the stuff that I've done. Or said another way, they're kind of acknowledging that they've got a lot of sexual stories in their life. Their puzzle of their life, a lot of the pieces have to do with sex. And in the way of example, let me just share a little bit from my own life, Tony's life. And everything that I'm going to mention right now is a true story from my own life. And if you've already heard the story of my life, you might know a lot of this, so it might not be too big of a surprise, but maybe some of it will be new. But here's just some of the sexual stories of my life. Of course, I would never suggest that this is anywhere complete, that I have so many sexual stories of my life, it's unbelievable. But there's the story when I was 8 or 9 and an older boy in the neighborhood explained to me what sex was for the very first time. I remember I didn't believe him. I thought he was making it up. I didn't know that moms and dads did that. Or the story when I was 10 years old and I found my dad's pornography in XXX books. Then there's the story of when I discovered masturbation and I thought I had broken my body when I ejaculated. The story of sneaking to see my dad's pornography, even though my mom was at home and I was afraid I might get caught. There's the story of the time I went pool hopping and skinny dipping in my neighborhood in the middle of the night because that's what they did in the pornographic book that I was reading. Then there's the story of when I was sexually abused by the older woman in the back seat of the car at the drive-in theater. There's the story of having oral sex done to me for the first time in my life when I was 13 or 14 years old. There's the story of the time my dad caught me masturbating. The story of when I lost my virginity. The story of when I thought my girlfriend might be pregnant and how relieved I was when she finally got her period. The story of my 2-month affair with a divorced woman who had a child. The story of me having sex on the same day I was ordained in Bible college, even though I wasn't married. The story of me becoming sexually involved with several different girls when I was a young pastor. The story of me having sex with 2 different girls, both on the same day. The story of the first time I had sex with Sherry. The story of the time I talked Sherry into having sex with me, even though she didn't want to. The story, or better said, stories of my wife not wanting to have sex with me during the early years of our marriage. The story of the time a woman tried to seduce me by showing me her breast. The story of the time I had a one-night stand with a woman I didn't even know. The story, or better said, stories of my affair with my best friend's wife. The story of my holy vow when I dedicated my penis, my orgasm, and my sexual gift back to God. The story of my complete sexual abstinence for 2 years after my holy vow to God. The story at the Hazelwood swimming pool when I heard God speak to me and I heard angels singing all around me. The story of me honoring God and honoring my wife with my sexual gift for the past 17 years and 4 months as of the day I'm recording this episode. And the story of my wife and I finally experiencing our honeymoon after 30 years of marriage. And on it goes. I wouldn't even suggest that this is anywhere a complete list of the sexual stories of my life. But can you imagine how many sexual stories does a person have in their life? How many sexual stories do you think that you have in your life? And have you ever thought about how those stories might have begun to layer themselves on top of each other, one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other, shaping you and impacting you and influencing you and determining the sexual trajectory of your life, influencing the kind of choices and decisions you would make, the kind of people you would hang around with, things that you would do and wouldn't do, and the way you began to express your sexual gift, and what you thought was normal, and what you thought you were supposed to do, and ways that you began to act out. Can you imagine how the sexual stories that have been layered in your life have affected you and influenced you and shaped you into the man that you are today, listening to this podcast, the man who's been a Christian for all these years, and yet you're still struggling with internet porn, and you can't break free, and you can't seem to honor God with the expression of your sexual gift. What's up? It has to do with your stories, and it has to do with this principle 8, because every person's life has many sexual stories. And by the way, I don't know if you've ever done a sexual inventory of your life or even thought about doing a sexual inventory of your life, but I might suggest that you think about doing it because I think it would give you a more comprehensive viewpoint and understanding of your own sexual life and your own sexual self and the sexual journey or trajectory of your life. And I think it might help you understand how you got to the man that you are today. I think it might help you understand yourself better than you've ever understood yourself before. So I recommend doing this assignment, guys. If it was just you and I right now in a counseling session in my office, I might ask this assignment of you. I want you to work on a sexual inventory of your life. And if you're really serious about finding health and freedom and wholeness and the healing and redemption and victory that God has intended for your sexuality and for your life, I think that your sexual inventory might be a very important tool, a very important stepping stone toward that forward progress. And with that being said, you guys, I see that I'm out of time from the clock. I can't believe how fast these episodes unfold. I hope you feel like by investing a half hour of your life that it was worth it, that what you heard today, what you're receiving from this podcast is worth 30 minutes of your life. I pray that it's helpful. I pray that it's encouraging. I pray that you are receiving a sense of strength and an intuition and a sense that's informing you, I can do this. My life is going to change. I can understand who I am. I can understand my stories. I'm starting to understand some things about myself now that I've never understood before. And God is going to do something in my heart and life that hasn't happened up to today. I am changing. I am growing. I'm becoming the man that God has called me to be. Or in the verbiage of episode 1 of the Power of Purity podcast, I'm closing the gap between the man that I've been and the man that God is calling me to be. I'm closing the gap, and I'm going to learn to control sex instead of being controlled by sex. I'm going to learn to bring my sexual gift under the authority of God. I'm going to learn to honor God and honor my wife with the expression of my sexual gift. For those who are married, for those who aren't married, you might say, I'm going to learn to honor God and honor my future wife with the expression of my sexual gift. So praise be to God. I pray that this episode has been encouraging and helpful and brings strength to you and hope. So in Jesus' name, I bless you, my brother. I pray that God would bless you. And I look forward to seeing you in our next episode of Understanding Your Story, where we will continue with Principle 9. God bless you and have an awesome day.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.